Welcome to Conversations Different. Each August, the best and brightest of creative Native America comes to Santa Fe for Santa Fe Indian Market. Among them in 2024 was Julian Brave NoiseCat, the co-director of the Sugarcane documentary, a stunning tribute to the resilience of Native people and their way of life. We waited to air the podcast and our interview with Julian until this month because now Sugarcane is out of the theaters and streaming on Hulu and Disney+. If you haven't seen this incredible film, we strongly recommend it. And now our conversation with Julian Brave NoiseCat. Welcome to Conversations Different, the podcast of the Santa Fe New Mexican focusing on the interesting people and places of northern New Mexico. As we're recording, Santa Fe Indian Market is gearing up, which means some of the most creative people in the world are right here in Santa Fe. And one of them is with us now, Julian Brave NoiseCat, journalist, writer, and now filmmaker. His first documentary, Sugarcane, is being screened in Santa Fe and released around the country. He's the co-director with Emily Cassie, and the two of them have won a Sundance Film Festival award as directors, and the film itself is winning honors at festivals across the nation and world. Welcome, Julian.
Gonna wait. It's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
I was thinking about your life right now. You've been promoting the film. You're doing interviews. You also have a book coming out. I just wonder how exhausted you are.
I feel incredibly lucky to be doing what I'm doing. Not very many people get to make a living making documentaries and writing books. Yes, I'm tired, and to tell this kind of a story, in particular, a story about my family and my own grappling with the intergenerational impacts of a genocide perpetrated against our people. It's a heavy thing to carry around and to talk about over and over again with audiences and stuff. But at the same time, it's a responsibility that was put before me in ways that were largely beyond my control, and that I'm really grateful to help carry. And it's also been incredibly moving to see audiences respond to the film, particularly Native audiences.
Yeah. I know one of the realities of Native life is that so many things aren't talked about because it's too painful and it's hard and you move on. And in this case, as I read, Emily called you. Emily Cassie's the co-director, and she's someone you've been co-workers, you've been friends for a long time, and she had read about some undiscovered graves that were revealed up in Canada. And
so in May of 2021, 215 potential unmarked graves were discovered at the Kamloops Indian Residential School in British Columbia, which actually happens to be one of the schools that my family was sent to, and is also the school where, at least on the campus, the former campus of that school, that's where we have the big Kamloops powwow every year, which is like the biggest Native celebration in our region, and actually makes an appearance in the documentary. But so there was this discovery at the Kamloops Indian Residential School that became an international headline. And Em, who has spent years as an investigative journalist and a multimedia journalist covering geopolitical conflict, human rights abuses, and atrocities all around the world, but who is also Canadian, she grew up in Toronto, saw this story and felt really pulled to it. She'd never actually covered her own country, and so she looked for a First Nation that was going to begin a search like the one that had found these unmarked graves at Kamloops. And she found an article in the Williams Lake Tribune about Chief Willie Sellers and the Williams Lake First Nation, and she sent Chief Willie a cold email. And that very day, Willie got back to her and said, "The creators always had good timing. Just yesterday, our chief and counsel had a conversation about how we needed to have our investigation at St. Joseph's Mission documented." At the same time, she also had reached out to me about potentially collaborating with her on a documentary about Indian residential schools, not any particular school, just about the subject.
And that's where it gets not spooky, but a little interesting in terms of the school that she ended up picking.
Yeah.
Because that became a general story to a very personal story for you.
Well, it took some time, but yes. So I took some time to think about whether I would be open to collaborating with Emily on a documentary. I had just signed a book contract, and I'd never written a book before, and
Wow.
I'd never made a film. And doing both at the same time felt kind of irresponsible. And more to the point, I didn't know if I was ready to work on a story about Indian residential schools, especially in a new medium. And so I took a couple weeks, and it really was a couple weeks to think about it. And in that time, Emily had forged ahead and reached out to the Williams Lake First Nation and secured access to follow their search. And after that, I got back in touch with her and I said, hey, I've thought about it and I think I'd be open to collaborating with you on this documentary. And that's when she said, that's amazing. Well, let me tell you about the progress I've made. I've identified a First Nation that's leading a search, and that search is happening at St. Joseph's Mission. And I just about fell out of my chair, as you might imagine.
Yeah.
And then I said, that's crazy. Did you know that's the school that my family was sent to and where my father was born? Because Em did not know that she, out of 139 Indian residential schools, had chose the one school where my father's life began.
Man, you can't write that as a Hollywood story. That has to be real life.
Yeah, I think it makes you really think about what forces in this world sometimes drive present events.
Yeah.
And, this story is in many ways it's about a lot of things, but it's in many ways it's about spirituality, faith and belief, and our relationship to those who've come before. Of course, the Indian residential schools were, among other things, a process of systematic spiritual colonization that was designed to replace indigenous belief with Catholicism. And, at the same time, an investigation into potential abuse and missing children is inherently about prior generations and about those who've gone on before. And in my people's narrative traditions, we take very seriously the possibility of connections to ancestors, to the departed, and we also take their agency in this world very seriously. We carry their names, we pray to them, and sometimes we believe that they play a part in what happens here on this side. And if you're an Indigenous filmmaker who happens to, by circumstances not of their own making, end up co-directing a documentary about an investigation at the Indian residential school where your dad was born and nearly died, I think that you have to take those ideas and traditions seriously.
Yeah. And let's talk just a minute about who your dad is, because he's not just your dad. He's a really respected and renowned artist. And I mean, people know who Ed Archie NoiseCat is.
Yeah, that name might mean something around here.
Yeah. And there's a connection to Santa Fe because he lived here for a number of years.
About 15 years.
Yeah. And his daughter grew up here, your little sister.
My little sister grew up here, went to the Santa Fe Indian School, proud graduate of the Santa Fe Indian School. Her mom, Lisa, still lives here. And I also happen to have a 505 area code number because when I was a little kid, I inherited one of Lisa's old phone numbers and cell phones from my dad.
That's funny.
So I actually have a 50, even though I never lived here, I would visit a lot and or visit often, not a lot. And so, there's a deep Santa Fe connection. And, my dad was, last night we were out in the plaza, or was this morning? Yeah, this morning we were out in the plaza. He doesn't go out at night as much anymore.
That is a change.
And we were getting breakfast and he was pointing out the different places where he was like, oh man, I have so many memories around here. And he was pointing to a balcony here and it was like, yeah, we had a crazy party over here and crazy parties over there. So he's a little infamous around these parts.
Yes. Well, and not just for his personality, but people respect his artistic ability.
Yeah, no, my dad's
he's a big deal.
My dad's an incredible artist. He has work in the Smithsonian. He had work in a number of galleries around here, and it's really incredible to be the son of somebody who has had the opportunity to dedicate so much of their life and their talent to making art. And I to this day I love my dad's work, and one of my favorite things to do because of him is to hang out with him in his studio and also to visit other artist studios and to see the work that they're making. I've had the opportunity to do that a lot, particularly with him and because of him. And I just think that having that as part of my life, has really influenced the art that I practice in obviously very different mediums.
Yeah. On that note, we'll take a quick break and be back in a moment with more Conversations Different.
Are you dreaming of a home of your own in Santa Fe, but feel like your finances aren't where they need to be? HomeWise is here to help. We offer free financial coaching and classes in English and Spanish that will help you proactively manage your money and get you qualified for the best mortgage loan possible. Contact us today to register for an in-person or online class, or to speak with a home purchase advisor who you can work with one-on-one to help you increase your savings, reduce your debt, and improve your credit score. Call 505-983-9473 or visit us at homewise.org. Equal Housing Lender, NMLS number 188231.
We're back with Julian Brave NoiseCat. Over the break, we started talking about how his dad, Ed Archie NoiseCat, ended up in New York City. And that led us to the story of how his parents met. We pick up the interview in the middle of that story.
My mom was the bartender. She was behind the bar, and he had this golden feast ladle earring in his ear. And after flirting with her all night, he took the earring out of his ear and he gave it to her.
And that's a meet cute.
Yeah, it is kind of a, well, I mean, it didn't work out, and the drinking thing became a bit of a problem. But I think it is a very beautiful story, and they were married for a number of years and moved all over. They lived in Minnesota, which is where I was born, Florida for a little while, and then ended up in Oakland because my dad was an artist and my mom got jobs in those places. And in Oakland, they split. My dad ended up with Lisa, my little sister's mom. My little sister was born in the Bay Area as well, and then they moved down here, which is where Lisa's from, where Zia's family's from, and also happens to be, the mecca of Indian art.
Yeah.
It's I call it Indian Hollywood, or it's the place with more silver and turquoise in the world than anywhere else.
Yes. Well, my son says the reason he likes it here is that he doesn't have to explain who he is, because as he's enrolled in Taos Pueblo and his dad's there, and he's mixed because of me, and he says people know what I am. Mm-hmm. And there's something about that acceptance and understanding, if you're a Native person, that you don't have in that many places in the country. So,
yeah, and there's also just an incredible history of remarkable Native artists moving here and calling this place their home.
Yeah.
Everyone from the artisans who you'll see out on the plaza, sitting on their blankets, selling their jewelry, to, Alan Hauser and some of the incredible greats of our traditions, all have connections to Santa Fe.
Yeah, no, the Institute of American Indian Arts really started a lot of careers and has continued to draw people. And now we have the whole writing renaissance with Tommy Orange and Layli Long Soldier and all of those people. And I always claimed you a little bit because I knew your relatives here. Mm-hmm. And when you were a journalist and, going on Twitter to say, Deb Holland should be Interior Secretary, I was like, that's our guy.
Deb for Interior. Yeah, I stopped at Laguna to get a Laguna burger the other day, and I snapped a selfie and I sent it to her.
Oh, that's awesome. Because, really, you think about, how old were you about then? Because you're not very old right now.
It was about 4 or 5 years ago now.
Yeah.
So I was maybe, 27?
Okay,
yeah.
So at 27, you basically changed the course of a cabinet secretary's job. You helped a lot.
I helped, yeah. No, so I guess, the story there is that I worked for a kind of left-wing think tank at the time.
Nice.
And we came up with this sort of fantasy football style list of potential cabinet picks for a potential Biden administration the summer before the election. And, just to give your listeners an idea of the kinds of people we're putting on this list, we put Barbara Lee, who was my congressman growing up, because for defense secretary or something like that, because she was the only person to not vote for the authorization of the use of force after 9/11. We had Keith Ellison, the Bernie surrogate and now Minnesota Attorney General for the United States Attorney General. And as I joked to Deb later, we might as well have put the Lorax for EPA Secretary, because, these were some pretty left-leaning picks. But in our list, I happened to include a first-term member of Congress named Deb Haaland, who your listeners, I'm sure, no doubt know, from the congressional district just nearby here. And it just happened to catch on.
Yeah.
And because of my position as a journalist and an originator of this idea and the relationship that I had with her, I was put in this position where I could help advocate in the press, on social media with a lot of memes and the hashtag #DebForInterior, and through other methods of influence that exist in our political and media ecosystem, for her to become the first ever Native American cabinet secretary. And I think it's one of the coolest things that I will ever have had the opportunity to be a part of. And I think that she is incredibly deserving and remarkable politician. Politicians are not the greatest people often in the world, but she's really true and stands up for what she believes in. And I think that she's done a great job, particularly with the federal inquiry into Native American boarding schools, which happens to connect to the documentary in the sense that it's driving a conversation that is long overdue about what happened here to First Peoples.
Yeah, because one of the things that's so popular today is to say, well, that was the past, we have to move on. But you can't move on until you address the wrongs. And at least, I love the beginning and the trailer. It's one thing to apologize. It's another thing to take action. Mm-hmm. So what action do we need to take, and how can we make things right?
Well, I think the first thing is that, in Canada, this process is called truth and reconciliation. And often I feel that there's a preemptive move to get to the reconciliation part really quick, to get Indigenous peoples to make peace with the Canadian government and the Catholic Church. And I'm kind of skeptical about that. But the part of this that I think is really essential is understanding the full scope of the truth of these institutions. This is, I think, especially important because the survivors of Indian residential schools, as well as Native American boarding schools, are in most cases now quite elderly. This is our grandparents' generation that we're talking about. And the experience of what happened there and the memory of, in some instances, really pernicious abuse and even atrocity is going to slip from the living world if we don't do the work of documenting and listening. And then I think as communities and families who are living with this history of reconciling with each other and ourselves, because part of what these schools did was not just abuse children and separate them from their families. They also created cycles of violence, abuse, and addiction in our own families and communities. And that is a part of this conversation that is going to take a long time for us to really grapple with and to move forward from.
Yeah, I think about it in my own life is that, I'm a Hispanic Roman Catholic, born and raised, 17th generation New Mexican on my mom's side. And we married in the church at Taos Pueblo. We brought our son up as a Catholic because that's what I was raised to do. And the older I get, the more I think about how do you bring a Native person up as a Catholic, considering the many back and forths that have happened in our state. The Pueblo Revolt began with the killing of priests because the church had been so cruel. Mm-hmm. I mean, there was a reason they killed the priests first. And it's like your individual family you have to grapple, and then you have to think of the generations of trauma.
Yes, and at the same time, part of grappling with this history, especially in the context of sugarcane and the world that my family comes from, is also grappling with my grandparents' generation, their continued attachment to the Catholic faith. I think that there's a way in which survivors often separate the church as an institution and their abusers from the faith itself, which I think is a very interesting intellectual move. I'm not sure I agree with it. I myself am not Catholic, but it's one that, I think we need to respect and take seriously. I think there are ways in which it can be very human for people to, on the one hand, know that they were deeply wronged by representatives of their faith, and on the other hand, to remain committed to the traditions that they know, and the traditions that sometimes include some of our own culture. At Secwepemc funerals, for example, we do the hymns in Secwepemchin, our first language. My Ke'a and her sister and the elder women mostly will stand up in front of the mourners, and they will, sing "O Tekelt Mich," and all these other sort of Catholic hymns in our own language.
Yeah, we do that here. The Archbishop of Santa Fe, Michael Sheehan, the late Archbishop, told me once the most faithful Catholics in New Mexico remain the Pueblo people. And every Pueblo has a Blessed Kateri prayer circle. The feast days are aligned to the Catholic Church. But I do think the generational divide is it's different now. It's
certainly, I would say that, it's true across many different faiths, but, my grandparents' generation remains, I bought rosaries for my Ke'a and her sister when we went to the Vatican for the documentary, and I brought them home to them. My dad, on the other hand, is like militantly anti-Catholic for very understandable reasons. I am not a member of the Catholic Church or faith, but I'll go to Christmas Mass. I know a lot of the prayers and rituals and all that sort of stuff, particularly the ones that we do in our own community. And I think in this documentary we wanted to treat that contradiction fairly, because it would be very easy, I think, to dismiss Catholicism wholly as this outside imposition and justification for a violent form of colonialism that was exacted upon children, and there would be a lot of truth in saying that, but it would leave out the part where some of those very same survivors of that violence and abuse, part of how they try to move forward and try to find peace is through Catholic prayer, is with
through their
the
faith.
Rosaries in their hand.
Yeah. There's nothing like a beautiful Mass to calm your soul. And yet, you're right, the contradiction is there, and it is, the strength of the Catholic faith has always been the ability to assimilate indigenous beliefs, whether it's the Celts in Ireland or Native people here, into the wider religion. That's how they survived all over the world.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of sort of more academic points you could get into about this that might be a little bit boring, but there are certain elements of Catholicism, the emphasis on sort of ritual that I can see as being actually not so different from certain indigenous spiritual practices. The holy water, the burning of incense, they're not so different from some of the things that our own people do. And I think, if you look back at what our people in British Columbia were facing in the late 1800s, there was this massive wave of epidemic of smallpox specifically that caused enormous, unfathomable amounts of death. There was a massive land grab, and there was a policy of not recognizing First Nations people's claim to land in any legal form. And so in that context, First Nations were looking for any sort of ally out in the world. And it just so happened that one of those allies at the time could be the church. That was a complicated, and this is probably a bad metaphor given what happened later. This is very strange bedfellows, but that is part of the origin of how you end up with this system where the people who believe that they are, quote unquote, civilizing us and, quote unquote, helping us, assimilate into the realities of colonial modernity also end up doing immense harm to families and to children.
Oh, and on that happy note, we'll take a quick break and be back in a moment with Conversations Different.
This is Patrick Dorsey, publisher of the Santa Fe New Mexican. Looking to reach a wider audience and grow your business? For 175 years, the Santa Fe New Mexican has been the trusted voice of Santa Fe, with unmatched local reach in print and online. In addition to our long-standing, independent, family-owned newspaper, we have a full-fledged marketing team with the expertise to help you succeed in the 21st century. From traditional print to precision-targeted digital advertising, we have the tools to connect you with your ideal customers. Partner with us and see the results for yourself. Advertise with the Santa Fe New Mexican and unlock your business's full potential. Visit us at santafenewmexican.com/advertising or call us at 505-995-3852. Thank you.
We are back talking to Julian Brave NoiseCat, who I think has the best byline I ever read. I used to love seeing your name on stories because I just think that's the best name.
Yeah.
You have to live up to your middle name, don't you?
It's a lot of names. But yeah, no, I'm really grateful for it. When my dad got married to my mom, he reclaimed an ancestral name. So after being born at St. Joseph's Mission, my dad was brought back to the Cannon Lake Indian Reserve, where he was for the first 7 years of his life raised by his grandparents, Jacob and Alice. Alice had the last name NoiseCat, spelled Noiscat. It's an ancestral name from Canoe Creek, an area called Stewachumch in our language, and we actually don't really know what NoiseCat translates to anymore. It's been lost to colonization, but it means something like potentially like long day or tall timber day. Anyways, so he reclaimed that name, which because of the way it had been written down by the missionaries who wrote all of our names down pretty poorly and often just renamed us when they baptized us as NoiseCat.
Okay.
And then the Brave actually ironically comes from my white grandmother, where she was like, yeah, he's, name him Brave. He's a little brave.
Oh, I thought it was your spirit, not that you were going to be. That's okay.
Well, it was both. I think
yeah.
that she was a clever woman, and she thought it was both, appropriate and kind of funny. So
no, that works. That works. So Archie was his original last name. Is that?
Archie was the name, that was given to us by the missionaries.
Okay,
yes.
that's right.
But technically, he could have had many different last names. My grandfather's last name was Peters.
Mm-hmm.
So some of my aunties and uncles have the last name Peters, and the Peters family is this giant family, originally from Chamaquam, but now mostly in Mount Curry. And then actually, my father's father's father was a guy named Ambrose Williams, so we could be Williams. So you could go all different. We could have many different aliases.
You have many names.
Many names.
Now, the story of a people that is so mistreated, nearly genocided out of existence, has to be a burden making that film. But on top of that, you're going into your father's life. And being born at a boarding school means that his mother was probably very young. It wasn't necessarily that she wanted to have a baby at that point in her life. Mm-hmm. And how do you revisit that in a story without breaking your heart?
Well, very cautiously, very slowly at the pace of, family and human relationships. So to make Sugarcane, I actually moved back in with my dad, who was living in Bremerton, Washington at the time. It's a little Navy town on the Kitsap Peninsula across from Seattle. And I had been living on the East Coast for about a decade. I went to school out there, and then
you went to Columbia, right?
Yep. And then I was working out there. I was living in DC at the time, and I got this book deal, and then I agreed to work on this documentary. And because both of those, in a way, have to do with my relationship to my dad and figuring that all out, I chose to move back in with him. I hadn't lived with him since I was a little kid. And so, after all those years of kind of estrangement, we lived across the hallway from each other and, cooked each other breakfast and spent many nights up hanging out, playing cribbage and Scrabble. He loves Scrabble. He loves to invent words in Scrabble that are not words. And then, listening to each other and hearing his stories. And I think that, firstly made it possible to have some of the hard conversations that we had in the film. It also made it very clear that he had all of these questions about his birth that if he couldn't find answers for them, he at least wanted to be able to ask them. And, I think that also made me feel comfortable because I feel, a lot of love, obviously, for both him and my who endured abuse that she still can't speak about at St. Joseph's Mission. It made me feel comfortable moving forward with that. And then, I would also say that my family, including my grandmother, were very, very cautious themselves, but also ultimately understanding and accommodating. And I just ultimately feel so grateful to come from the people that I come from very loving, strong people who really value family and being together. I just am so grateful for them, and I love them very much.
Yeah, and coming to bring the truth to the surface is a kind of a healing if it's done in a a thoughtful way. I think. Do you feel like that's helped your family grow closer?
Yeah, I think a big part of what the documentary is about and what this life experience more broadly was about was, the truth is this deeply painful thing that our people, and my family in particular, has suppressed for so long in order to survive, in order to move forward. And I think that a big part of the pain and anxiety around this wave of stories about potential unmarked graves at Indian residential schools all across Canada, as well as in the United States, has been, well, what does this truth coming out, what is these spirits coming back home, is that going to be a truth that is going to wound, or is that going to be a truth that helps us lay these things to rest and to move forward? And, I think that the truth of the matter is that it was a combination of both more broadly. In Cannon Lake, there has been a lot of young people who've been dying over the last number of years. During the making of Sugarcane, I attended 10 funerals for mostly people who are in their 30s and 40s. And that is, I believe, and I think many experts would say as well, the part of the legacy of Indian residential schools, that the death toll from these institutions is not just something in the past, it's in the present, and it exists in the form of addiction that people use to treat their suffering. It exists in the form of abuse, of violence, of abandonment, of all these sort of cycles that you can trace back to the separation of children from their families and then what those children endured at Indian residential schools. At the same time, our people have this really beautiful way of living in relation to each other, of living in the places that we come from, and in our instance as Secwepemc and as broader Salish peoples, where we've been living for literally thousands of years, and doing that in a way that really understands that being related to each other, that being someone's cousin, being someone's aunt, uncle, brother, sister, what have you, means something, and I think that I feel really lucky to come from a family that is firstly mostly above ground rather than below it, because there are families that are have been really laid low by this history, and also a family that, despite our shit, which all families have, I should say, really values that togetherness, really loves each other, really spends meaningful time together. And that is what has helped us endure, and it's definitely what has helped me and my dad come back into a closer relationship and come out of the other side of this thing with, and I don't use this word lightly at all because I think can be overused in this context, but with a real sense of healing.
And on that note, this has been another Conversations Different. We'll be back next week.